Nelson was walking home from school one afternoon. He had his backpack on and his head full of thoughts about homework. He wasn't in a great mood. Another long, boring day at school, he thought. His feet dragged a little on the dusty sidewalk. Then something caught his eye. It was a bright, colorful flyer stuck on a lamppost. The words "Dog Agility Contest" were written in bold red letters across the top. Nelson stopped, curious. He leaned in to read more. Join the fun. Show off your dog's skills. Win amazing prizes. The flyer said. Below, there was a picture of a big, happy dog jumping over a bar. Nelson's face lit up. His mind went straight to Apollo, his dog, his best buddy. Apollo was a playful German shepherd, full of energy. Nelson had never done anything like this before, but the idea got stuck in his head. He could already imagine Apollo running, jumping, and weaving through obstacles. It looked like so much fun. I should enter this contest, he whispered to himself. He ripped the flyer off the pole and stuffed it into his pocket. At home, he couldn't wait to share the news. He burst through the door and shouted, "Mom, Dad, there's going to be a dog contest in town." His mom was busy cooking in the kitchen, and his dad was sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper. They both turned to look at him. "A dog contest?" his mom asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," Nelson said, out of breath. "I want to enter it with Apollo." His dad put down the newspaper and frowned. "Nelson, do you even know what a dog agility contest is?" "Of course," Nelson replied confidently, even though he really didn't know all the details. He explained what he had read on the flyer. His parents listened, but they didn't seem very excited. "Nelson, training a dog for something like that takes time," his dad said slowly. "You can't just sign up without knowing what you're doing." "But I'll learn," Nelson argued. "Apollo can do it." "I know he can." His mom sighed and wiped her hands on a towel. "It's not that we don't believe in you, Nelson. It's just, well, this sounds hard. You have school, and you've never trained Apollo for something like this before." Nelson felt his heart sink a little. He thought his parents would be proud and happy. But now they were doubting him. He didn't want to give up, though. "Please," he said softly. "Just give me a chance. Let me try." Before his parents could respond, Nelson heard a knock at the door. It was his best friend, Jake. Jake was a tall, skinny boy with messy brown hair. He was always up for an adventure. "What's up, Nelson?" Jake asked, stepping inside. "Man, I found this flyer for a dog contest," Nelson explained, showing it to him. "I want to enter with Apollo, but my parents think it's a bad idea." Jake read the flyer and grinned. "A dog contest? That sounds awesome. You should totally do it." "See," Nelson said, turning to his parents. "Jake thinks it's a great idea." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Come on, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Nelson's got Apollo. That dog's a beast. He's smart, strong, and fast. They got a real shot." Nelson's dad chuckled softly. "Well, I suppose it couldn't hurt to let you try. But you'll have to take this seriously, Nelson. If you want to do it, you'll need to work hard." "Yes," Nelson cheered. He turned to his mom, who gave a small smile and nodded. "Okay," she said, "but don't let this distract you from school." "I won't," Nelson promised. Later that evening, Nelson and Jake sat on the front steps with Apollo, who wagged his tail happily, unaware he was about to become the star of Nelson's plan. "All right, boy," Nelson said, patting Apollo. "We've got a lot of work to do, but I believe in you." Jake grinned. "This is going to be epic. You and Apollo are going to crush it." The next morning, Nelson woke up early, excited to start training. Jake arrived with cones and a hula hoop. Together, they set up a simple obstacle course in Nelson's backyard. However, things didn't go as planned. Apollo knocked over cones, ran in circles, and ignored the broomstick jump. "Man, this is harder than I thought," Jake said, laughing as Apollo ran around aimlessly. Nelson sighed in frustration, unsure of how to teach his dog. An elderly neighbor, Mr. Harrison, noticed their struggle and introduced himself as a former dog trainer. "I can help, but training a dog takes teamwork and patience. Are you up for it?" "Yes," Nelson agreed eagerly. With Mr. Harrison's guidance, they focused on the basics. Over the next week, Apollo began improving. His zigzagging through cones and jumps became more precise. Nelson was feeling hopeful until a setback hit. During practice, Apollo stumbled on a jump and sprained his paw. Nelson panicked, But Mr. Harrison reassured him. It's just a sprain, but he needs rest. If you push him too hard, he'll get worse. Nelson felt crushed, but knew he couldn't risk Apollo's health. With Mr. Harrison's advice, they adjusted their training to include lighter exercises. Jake helped by suggesting low-stress play with a frisbee, which slowly lifted Nelson's spirits. After a few days of recovery, Apollo's energy returned. Nelson decided to train on a professional agility course. The setup was intimidating with tall hurdles and tunnels, but they pushed forward. Their progress was interrupted by a boy named Ethan, who showed off his highly trained border collie, Titan. Titan's flawless performance shook Nelson's confidence. "See? That's what real training looks like," Ethan taunted. "You don't stand a chance." Nelson clenched his fists but remained calm. "We'll see." Refusing to give up, Nelson and Apollo practiced harder, improving with each run. "You're doing great, Apollo," Nelson said, giving his dog a treat. Jake grinned. "Ethan doesn't know what you and Apollo are made of." As Ethan walked by, he smirked. "See you at the contest." Nelson stood tall, determined. "Tomorrow, we train even harder," he whispered to Apollo. They weren't backing down. Together, they would face every challenge and grow stronger. The contest was fast approaching, and Nelson was ready to give it his all. The next morning, Nelson was up early again. The contest was only a few days away. He could feel the pressure building. Every time he thought about Ethan and Titan, a knot formed in his stomach. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. They had work to do. When Nelson reached the backyard, Apollo was already wagging his tail, eager to start training. "Good boy," Nelson said, scratching behind Apollo's ears. "Today's going to be important." Jake arrived soon after, carrying a stopwatch. "All right, Nelson. Mr. Harrison said he's got something special planned for us." Sure enough, a little later, Mr. Harrison appeared with a clipboard and a whistle. He smiled as he saw Nelson, Jake, and Apollo waiting for him. "Morning, boys. I've got a surprise for you today," he said. "What is it?" Nelson asked curiously. "I've set up a mock trial," Mr. Harrison replied. "It's like a practice contest. You'll go through the entire course just like you will on competition day. This will help you and Apollo get used to the pressure." Nelson's eyes widened. "That's awesome. We definitely need that." Mr. Harrison nodded. "You'll be timed, and I'll give you feedback afterward. We'll do a couple of rounds to build your confidence." They walked to the local training course, where Mr. Harrison had already set everything up. There were cones, jumps, tunnels, and weave poles, all arranged just like in a real contest. Nelson felt a mixture of excitement and nerves as he looked at the course. "All right, Nelson," Mr. Harrison said. "Take a deep breath. Remember, it's just practice. Focus on your connection with Apollo. Trust each other." Nelson nodded and led Apollo to the starting line. He crouched down and whispered, "We've got this, buddy. Just like we practiced." Apollo barked softly, as if to say he understood. Mr. Harrison blew the whistle, and they were off. Nelson gave clear commands as they moved through the course. "Weave, Apollo, jump, tunnel." At first, Apollo hesitated at the tunnel. He sniffed the entrance, unsure if he should go through. Nelson's heart pounded. "Come on, Apollo. You can do it," he called out, his voice steady but encouraging. Apollo hesitated for a second longer, then dashed through the tunnel. Nelson grinned as they kept moving. They stumbled on a few more obstacles, but Apollo recovered quickly each time. By the end of the course, they were both panting but smiling. "Time!" Jake shouted, holding up the stopwatch. "Not bad, Nelson. You guys did great." Mr. Harrison approached with a satisfied nod. "That was a solid run. A few small mistakes, but nothing you can't fix. You and Apollo are starting to click as a team." Nelson wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Thanks, Mr. Harrison. That tunnel slowed us down, but we'll keep working on it." "Exactly," Mr. Harrison said. "It's all about staying calm under pressure. You did well." Over the next few hours, they repeated the trial a few more times. Each run went smoother than the last. Apollo became more confident with every obstacle. Nelson's parents showed up later in the afternoon to check on him. They had been skeptical about the contest at first, but they were starting to notice how serious Nelson was about it. "How's the training going?" his mom asked as she approached the course. "It's going really well," Nelson said, trying to hide his surprise. His parents didn't usually come to watch. They stood by and observed as Nelson and Apollo tackled the course one more time. This time, Apollo didn't hesitate at the tunnel. He flew through it and completed the rest of the obstacles with ease. "Wow," his dad said, clapping his hands. "That was impressive." Nelson smiled, feeling a warm sense of pride. "Thanks, Dad. We've been working really hard." His mom nodded. "I can see that. I didn't realize how much effort you were putting into this. I'm proud of you." Hearing those words made Nelson's chest swell with happiness. He had wanted their support from the beginning, and now he finally had it. Jake gave him a playful nudge. "Told you they'd come around." Mr. Harrison walked over to the group and smiled. "You've got a talented son and a smart dog. They make a good team." "Looks like it," Nelson's mom said with a grin. Nelson felt more confident than ever. The contest was still going to be tough, especially with competitors like Ethan and Titan, but he knew he wasn't alone. He had his family, his friends, and Mr. Harrison all supporting him. And most importantly, he had Apollo. "Let's head home and rest," Nelson said after the final run. "We got a big day ahead soon." As they packed up and walked back, Nelson looked down at Apollo and smiled. "We're ready for this," he said softly. Apollo wagged his tail, his eyes shining with excitement. They had come a long way, and the biggest challenge was just around the corner. The contest was near, and Nelson knew they would give it everything they had. The day of the contest had finally arrived. Nelson woke up before the sun, his heart racing with excitement and nerves. Today was the day he and Apollo had been training for. He got dressed quickly and ate a small breakfast, though he wasn't really hungry. "You'll do great, honey," his mom said, giving him a reassuring smile. His dad patted him on the back. "Just stay calm and focus," his dad added. "Thanks," Nelson said, feeling a little more confident. He grabbed Apollo's leash and headed out the door. Jake was already waiting outside. "Ready for the big day?" Jake asked with a grin. "As ready as we'll ever be," Nelson replied. Apollo barked happily, sensing the excitement in the air. When they arrived at the contest grounds, the place was packed. There were dogs of all shapes and sizes, along with their handlers. Some of the competitors looked really serious, like they had been doing this for years. Nelson felt a wave of doubt creep in, but shook it off. "You've got this," Jake said, noticing Nelson's hesitation. "Just focus on Apollo. Forget about the others." "Yeah, you're right," Nelson said, taking a deep breath. Mr. Harrison met them near the registration area. He handed Nelson a numbered vest. "You and Apollo are in the intermediate category," he explained. "You'll face a few rounds, and each one gets harder. Stay sharp." Nelson nodded. "Thanks, Mr. Harrison. We won't let you down." The first round began shortly after. Nelson watched from the sidelines as the early competitors ran the course. The obstacles looked even more intimidating with the pressure of the crowd and the judges watching closely. One competitor, a tall girl with a sleek golden retriever, flew through the course without a single mistake. The crowd cheered loudly as she crossed the finish line. "Wow," Jake whispered. "She's really good." Nelson swallowed hard. "Yeah, but we can do this." When it was finally their turn, Nelson led Apollo to the starting line. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on them. His palms were sweaty, and his heart pounded in his chest. "You've got this, Apollo," he whispered. "Let's show them what we can do." The whistle blew, and they were off. Nelson gave clear, steady commands as they moved through the course. "Jump," he called out. Apollo soared over the hurdle. "Whee!" Apollo zigzagged through the poles, barely brushing one of them. "Tunnel." Apollo hesitated for a brief moment, but then dashed through the tunnel. The crowd clapped as they completed the run. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to advance to the next round. Nelson let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "You nailed it," Jake said, giving him a thumbs up. Mr. Harrison smiled as he approached. "That was solid. You stayed focused. Keep it up in the next round." As the day went on, the competition grew tougher. Some of the more experienced competitors handled the obstacles flawlessly. Nelson and Apollo had to push themselves to keep up. Each round required faster times and fewer mistakes. Finally, they reached the semifinal round. Nelson glanced at the other remaining competitors. Ethan and Titan were among them. Ethan caught Nelson's eye and smirked. "Still hanging in there," Ethan said with a mocking tone. Nelson didn't respond. He was too focused on the task ahead. He and Apollo had worked too hard to let anyone intimidate them now. The whistle blew for the semi-final round. Nelson and Apollo started strong, clearing the hurdles and poles with confidence. But then they reached the seesaw obstacle. This was one of the trickiest parts of the course. "Easy, Apollo," Nelson said gently. Apollo climbed onto the seesaw, balancing carefully. But halfway across, his paw slipped on the surface. The seesaw tipped too quickly, and Apollo stumbled. His back leg slipped off the edge. The crowd gasped loudly, and Nelson's heart stopped. "Apollo!" Nelson shouted. He ran forward, ready to help, but Apollo scrambled and managed to pull himself back onto the seesaw. He stood there, shaking slightly, unsure of what to do next. The judge gave Nelson a warning look. He had a few seconds to make a decision, continue or withdraw. If they kept going and made another mistake, they might be disqualified. But if they quit now, everything they had worked for would be over. Nelson took a deep breath. He crouched down and called out to Apollo. "You can do this, boy. I believe in you. Just take it slow." Apollo's ears perked up at Nelson's calm voice. Slowly, he moved forward, balancing carefully this time. He reached the end of the seesaw and jumped off safely. The crowd let out a cheer, and Nelson felt a rush of relief. "Good boy," Nelson praised as they continued the course. They finished strong, with only a few seconds to spare. Jake ran over as soon as they crossed the finish line. "That was intense. I thought my heart was going to explode." "Same," Nelson admitted, wiping sweat from his forehead. He hugged Apollo tightly. "You were amazing, buddy." Mr. Harrison walked over and gave Nelson a reassuring nod. "Remember what I told you. Stay calm, trust your dog, and keep your focus. Don't rush." "I will," Nelson said firmly. He crouched down and stroked Apollo's head. "All right, buddy. This is our last run. Let's give it everything we've got." Apollo barked softly in response, his eyes bright and alert. Nelson stepped up to the starting line. From the corner of his eye, he saw Ethan and Titan watching. Ethan gave him a smug grin, but Nelson ignored him. He was done letting others get in his head. The whistle blew, and they were off. "Jump!" Nelson shouted. Apollo soared over the first hurdle with ease. They moved quickly through the next few obstacles, gaining momentum. The crowd clapped and cheered, but Nelson kept his focus on Apollo. "Tunnel!" Nelson called out. Apollo dashed into the tunnel without hesitation. Nelson ran to the other side, calling his name. Apollo emerged smoothly, his paws hitting the ground in perfect rhythm. They were in sync, moving like a true team. Next came the weave poles. This was one of the trickiest parts. Nelson slowed his pace and gave Apollo clear guidance. "Weave, Apollo. Good boy, keep going." Apollo weaved through the poles with precision. Nelson's heart swelled with pride. They were nailing it. But the toughest obstacle was still ahead, the seesaw. Nelson felt a twinge of fear as they approached it. He remembered how Apollo had slipped earlier. "Easy, boy," Nelson said softly. "Take it slow." Apollo stepped onto the seesaw, his paws steady. Nelson held his breath as Apollo moved carefully forward. This time, there were no slips. The seesaw tilted smoothly, and Apollo jumped off at the end. "Yes!" Nelson cheered under his breath. The crowd roared in approval as they cleared the final hurdles. Nelson sprinted to the finish line with Apollo right by his side. They crossed it together, both panting hard but smiling. "You did it!" Jake shouted, running over to them. "That was awesome." Nelson knelt down and hugged Apollo. "You were amazing, buddy. I'm so proud of you." Mr. Harrison approached with a proud smile. "That was your best run yet. You and Apollo have come a long way." "Thanks, Mr. Harrison," Nelson said. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had given it their all, and that was what mattered. As the final competitors completed their runs, Nelson waited anxiously for the results. He wasn't sure how they would rank, but he knew they had done their best. After a while, the announcer stepped onto the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for an incredible competition today," he said through a microphone. "We've seen some outstanding performances from both experienced competitors and newcomers alike." Nelson stood with Apollo, his heart pounding. In first place, with the fastest time and no faults, Ethan and Titan. The crowd cheered as Ethan and Titan walked up to the podium. Ethan held his head high, clearly enjoying the attention. Nelson felt a brief sting of disappointment, but he quickly pushed it aside. They had come here to prove themselves, and that's exactly what they had done. And now, the announcer continued, we'd like to present a special award. The Best Newcomer Award goes to Nelson Carter and Apollo. Nelson's eyes widened in surprise. The crowd erupted in applause. Jake hooped loudly, and Mr. Harrison gave Nelson a proud nod. Go on, Jake urged, nudging Nelson forward. Nelson walked up to the podium with Apollo by his side. The announcer handed him a shiny plaque. This award is for your perseverance and teamwork, the announcer said. You and Apollo showed incredible determination today. Thank you, Nelson said, his voice steady but full of emotion. He looked down at Apollo, who wagged his tail happily. As they stood on the podium, Nelson realized something important. Winning first place wasn't everything. What truly mattered was the bond he had built with Apollo. They had faced setbacks, doubts, and challenges but had never given up. They had become a stronger team because of it. When the ceremony ended, Nelson's parents came over to congratulate him. We're so proud of you, his mom said, giving him a tight hug. You proved us wrong, son, his dad added with a smile. You showed real dedication out there. Nelson beamed. Thanks, Dad. It wasn't easy, but we did it. Jake grinned. Man, that plaque is just the beginning. You and Apollo are going to crush future contests. Maybe, Nelson said with a laugh. But for now, I'm just happy we made it through this one. He looked down at Apollo again and ruffled his fur. We did it, boy. We really did it. Apollo barked in agreement. Their journey wasn't over, but this victory felt like the perfect start.